The morning of December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, seemed like any other serene and beautiful Sunday, with the sun rising over the Pacific, casting golden rays across the calm waters, families strolling along the beaches, children laughing and playing, sailors writing letters home for Christmas, soldiers preparing for a relaxed day, and the mighty battleships of the United States Navy, Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada, West Virginia, California, and others, resting proudly in the harbor, their crews either polishing the decks, shaving in their quarters, or enjoying breakfast with friends, never suspecting that within minutes their world would be turned into an inferno of chaos, death, and destruction. In those early hours, Honolulu felt like paradise. Music played softly on radios, some soldiers rehearsed the national anthem, others read newspapers with coffee in hand, local residents carried on with their routines, fishermen prepared their nets, and nobody imagined that across the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of Japanese aircraft, bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes were already cutting through the sky in tight formations, their engines growling like a swarm of angry hornets, guided by elite pilots under strict orders to cripple America's Pacific Fleet in one decisive strike, because for years tension between the United States and Japan had been escalating. The U.S. having placed embargoes on oil and steel in response to Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia, particularly in China, but while political leaders debated in Washington and Tokyo, the soldiers and sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor remained blissfully unaware of the storm approaching them, living out their ordinary lives, calling loved ones, thinking about upcoming holidays, and making small talk, until suddenly, at 7:55 a.m., the roar of engines shattered the peace, and black silhouettes appeared against the bright morning sky, followed by the terrifying whistling sound of bombs dropping, the ground trembling as explosions erupted, first one, then another, then many more, until the entire harbor was engulfed in smoke and fire, the first torpedoes slamming into the sides of battleships, ripping open steel hulls, sending fountains of water and oil into the air. Sailors thrown violently across decks, some instantly killed, others horribly burned, some leaping into the harbor to escape the flames only to be strafed by enemy machine guns, and amid this hellish scene, USS Arizona took a direct hit to its forward magazine, producing an explosion so massive that the ship seemed to leap out of the water, split apart, and vanish in fire, taking over 1,000 men with it in an instant, their screams drowned by the thunder of destruction, their lives erased in seconds, while survivors clung desperately to wreckage or swam through burning oil, their faces blackened, their uniforms torn, their bodies covered in wounds, yet fighting to stay alive. At first, many thought it must be a drill, because the Navy sometimes conducted surprise exercises, but the sight of the rising sun insignia on the attacking planes removed all doubt. This was war, real and merciless, brought directly to America's doorstep, and panic spread as sailors rushed half-dressed from their bunks, grabbing rifles that were locked away, trying to man anti-aircraft guns that were not yet loaded, struggling to fight back even as bombs rained down with mechanical precision, hitting fuel depots, hangars, and airfields, setting planes ablaze before they could even take off, destroying entire squadrons on the ground, leaving American forces nearly defenseless. Meanwhile, civilians in Honolulu looked up in horror as the sky filled with smoke and fire, mothers clutching their children, fathers shouting in confusion, churches suddenly crowded with terrified people praying for mercy, while outside, houses rattled from the shock waves, windows shattered, and the once tranquil island paradise became a battlefield, its peaceful Sunday morning shattered forever. Within the first 15 minutes, the harbor was unrecognizable, battleships listing heavily to one side, sailors covered in oil crawling across twisted steel, medics rushing from one bleeding man to another, chaplains offering last prayers to the dying, and yet, amid the destruction, there were moments of staggering heroism, men who refused to abandon their stations, gunners who kept firing even as flames engulfed them, shipmates dragging the wounded through smoke and fire, some sacrificing their own lives so others could survive. It was chaos, confusion, and unimaginable bravery intertwined, and as the second wave of Japanese planes swept in, the horror only intensified, bombs pounding already burning ships, torpedoes sinking more vessels, and machine guns spraying everything that moved, turning Pearl Harbor into a nightmare of fire and steel, a graveyard of ships, and a crucible of courage where ordinary men faced death head-on. And though they were unprepared, though many weapons failed, though the attack had been a complete surprise, the spirit of those Americans, both soldiers and civilians, was already being tested in the flames of history, and the memory of that morning, once filled with laughter, sunlight, and calm seas, was now seared forever with the screams of the wounded, the roar of explosions, and the sight of ships sinking into the harbor that had once been their sanctuary. The morning of December 7, 1941, which just moments earlier had seemed calm and radiant, suddenly turned into an apocalypse that no American citizen could have ever imagined, and when Japanese aircraft ripped through the blue sky carrying death and destruction toward Pearl Harbor, a wave of terror, screams, and explosions consumed everything, freezing time in a way that those who survived could never forget. The mighty battleships that had only minutes ago floated peacefully on the quiet waves were now engulfed in a storm of fire and smoke. Bombs rained down on steel giants, the thunder of explosions echoing across the island. The USS Arizona became a blazing inferno in seconds, thousands of gallons of fuel erupting into towering flames and black smoke that darkened the heavens. Inside the vessel hundreds of sailors were trapped, many dying instantly in the blast, others consumed by fire. Some young men tried desperately to reach the hatches, but the searing heat and twisted steel blocked every exit. A few jumped into the water only to find it aflame with burning oil, their screams piercing the chaos as comrades watching helplessly from nearby decks clutched their chests in anguish, powerless to save them. Above them Japanese planes strafed with machine gun fire, raining bullets onto the already panicked crowd. Everywhere men ran, shouted, or collapsed, their world collapsing with them. Yet within this nightmare sparks of extraordinary bravery glowed. Sailors already wounded dragged their brothers out of the fire. One man, his clothes aflame, ignored his pain to rescue 3 crewmates from drowning. Another seized a deck gun and fired desperately at the enemy even though he knew his few rounds could not stop the storm of planes. This resistance, though small, was a testament to American grit and pride. Ordinary citizens of Oahu too did not back away. Nurses risked their own lives running into burning zones to treat the wounded. Women from nearby homes carried water and cloth to soothe seared bodies. The entire island had become a battlefield where courage fought against terror. Commanders struggled to regain control, but the attack was too sudden, too coordinated, and left no time for defenses to be fully raised. Radio operators frantically tried to send messages, though lines kept failing under the constant blast of bombs. And yet every second that passed etched itself into history. Those who survived would carry the images of this hell for life, watching their brothers perish, seeing America's pride in flames, feeling their country's heart bleed, but also making an oath within themselves that this strike would not break the United States. Instead it would awaken a storm of resolve that would rise from the ashes, stronger, fiercer, and determined never to let such horror befall them again. And thus in the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor the seeds of unshakable resolve were sown in every survivor's soul, a resolve that would change the course of America and the world forever. As the sun finally began to climb higher over Oahu, casting its golden light across a harbor that had turned into a graveyard of steel and smoke, the survivors of the attack stumbled out from the chaos with trembling hands, soot-covered faces, and hearts broken yet still beating with a strange mixture of grief and fury. For though the Japanese planes had departed leaving silence where hours earlier thunder had reigned, that silence was not peace, it was the eerie stillness of devastation. Broken only by the crackle of flames, the moans of the injured, and the distant splash of water where men still clung to floating wreckage. The USS Arizona had settled into the shallow harbor waters, its decks torn apart, smoke billowing endlessly from its torn hull, and around it the bodies of sailors floated quietly. Their youthful dreams ended in seconds, while nearby the USS Oklahoma lay capsized, its massive belly pointing upward like a wounded beast. Inside hundreds of men pounded desperately on the steel walls, trapped alive as their oxygen dwindled, their banging and muffled cries haunting the ears of comrades who could do nothing but listen in agony. Rescue teams rushed with torches and hammers to cut through the thick metal, some succeeding in pulling survivors from tiny air pockets, others forced to walk away in tears when the steel proved too strong and time too short. These sounds, the pounding, the crying, the desperate prayers, would live forever in the nightmares of those present, for they revealed not only the destruction of ships but the shattering of human hope. Yet even amid this tragedy the survivors displayed extraordinary acts of human spirit. Sailors drenched in oil formed human chains to drag the wounded from burning waters, others tore strips of their own uniforms to bind wounds, while chaplains, unarmed and unprotected, knelt among the dying to offer final prayers, their voices trembling yet steady, whispering words of comfort as bombs continued to detonate around them. On the shore civilians brought buckets of water, bread, and blankets. Mothers clasped crying children as they offered first aid to strangers, showing that in America's darkest morning, the ordinary people rose alongside the soldiers to stand as guardians of hope. Doctors in makeshift hospitals worked until their hands blistered, their white coats drenched in blood. Nurses fainted from exhaustion but refused to leave their stations, and above all of this hung an atmosphere of disbelief, the question on everyone's lips: how could this have happened? How could an island that only yesterday felt like paradise now resemble a nightmare battlefield? And as the smoke cleared, the survivors began to realize that the attack was not only against battleships and airplanes but against the very soul of the nation, an insult so deep that it could never be ignored. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would soon call December 7th a date which will live in infamy. But for the survivors it was already carved into their flesh, their lungs, their memories, for they had inhaled the smoke, carried the bodies, heard the cries, and felt the sting of helplessness. Many who walked away alive that day carried survivors' guilt, asking why fate had spared them when their brothers had perished beside them. Some vowed to enlist immediately, driven by a fire for justice. Others fell into silence, haunted by visions of burning ships and drowning friends. Yet all of them, whether loud or quiet, carried inside them a vow that America would never again be caught unprepared, never again allow such slaughter to arrive unannounced. And thus the survivors of Pearl Harbor became living symbols of both trauma and resolve, men and women who had seen hell yet chose to rise from it, knowing that their grief would be the fuel for their nation's entry into a global war, and that their tears would water the roots of an unbreakable determination that would soon sweep across the United States, igniting factories, filling recruitment centers, and transforming a wounded nation into a force that would one day return fire across the oceans. But in that moment, in the still smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor, they were simply human beings clutching one another, coughing, crying, yet standing, alive, and whispering through cracked lips the promise that the fallen would not be forgotten and the enemy would be answered. The weeks and months that followed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor were unlike anything the United States had ever faced, for the nation had been thrust headfirst into the deadliest war in human history, and the survivors of that fiery morning now carried scars, some etched deep into their bodies, others carved forever into their souls, that would define their lives and shape the destiny of a generation. As the smoke cleared from the shattered harbor and families buried their dead, a new wave of resilience swept across America, because men who had lost brothers and friends in the inferno of December 7th volunteered in staggering numbers, rushing to enlist in the Army, Navy, and Marines, driven not by glory but by the burning memory of comrades drowning in oil-slick waters or being consumed by flames on steel decks, while women, once bound by traditional roles, stepped boldly into factories and shipyards, taking up welding torches, riveting machines, and nursing uniforms, declaring through sweat and sacrifice that the nation would never again be caught unprepared. Pearl Harbor's survivors, many of them physically broken yet unyielding in spirit, became living symbols of this transformation, retelling the horrors of that morning not as tales of despair but as calls to vigilance and courage. And as America declared war on Japan and soon after faced Germany and Italy, those same sailors who had fought with bare hands and rifles against diving planes were shipped across the Pacific to carry the fight to enemy shores, their eyes hardened, their resolve unshakable. In the silence of hospitals across Hawaii and the mainland, young men learned to live without limbs, blind eyes searched for futures they could still shape, and grieving families transformed sorrow into determination, raising funds for war bonds, planting victory gardens, and writing letters of hope to loved ones overseas. Slowly, the shattered fleet was rebuilt, battleships rose again from the mud of Pearl Harbor, aircraft carriers replaced those lost, and American industry thundered like never before, producing planes, tanks, and ships at a pace that stunned the world. Yet through all the noise of war, the memory of that Sunday morning remained a constant drumbeat in the hearts of Americans. For children who had watched the skies rain fire grew into soldiers, and wives who had stood on shorelines weeping became the backbone of a nation at war. When victory finally came years later, with Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri in 1945, it was Pearl Harbor's ghosts that stood silently among the living, a reminder of the price paid for freedom. The survivors who returned to civilian life carried the weight of memory into their twilight years, often silent about the horrors but always watchful, gathering every December 7th at the harbor to lay flowers on the water, to salute the rusting remains of the Arizona where more than 1,000 of their brothers still rested, and to remind younger generations that vigilance is the price of liberty. In their wrinkled faces and trembling salutes lay the story of a nation transformed, a people who had once felt untouchable but were forever changed by one morning of fire and steel, and though time would eventually claim those last witnesses, their legacy endured, etched into history books, memorials, and the soul of a nation that would always remember that on December 7, 1941, the United States was attacked, wounded, but never defeated, and that out of the ashes of Pearl Harbor arose a generation whose courage carried the world to victory and whose sacrifice forever redefined what it meant to be American.